Hi, I'm Joe Miller, and I'm excited to have Fundraising HayDay with me here on GrantChat Live. Today we have Amanda.
Hello.
And we have Kimberly. I'll let them tell you a little bit about their background and what is happening with Fundraising HayDay. In fact, I know you're going to be kicking off season 3, and you have a wonderful story about ethics and mayhem. So please tell us a little bit about both of you, Fundraising HayDay, and then kick us off and tell us about season 3.
Well, a little bit about me. I have been in the fundraising and grant seeking field for a long time now, more than 20 years, more like 22. And I love it. I love working with nonprofits in particular, especially nonprofits in health and human services. And I also enjoy fundraising and strategic planning and all those kinds of things that you might associate with a development director kind of job. But what I love most is helping people learn about it. And so it was a natural fit when Amanda invited me to be her co-host 2 years ago, that we got together to do this podcast. And you're right, we just launched season 3, Three Little Fingers. And we're just excited to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, so I'm Amanda Day. I'm a grant professional certified and have been in the field 19 years now. Kimberly's kind of the yin to my yang. I'm a local government grant writer, mostly involved with federal and state grant writing.
Extrovert.
Oh. She's the introvert. Yeah. So yeah, that's how we fit together nicely. And like you said, podcast just aired season 3 at the end of May, and we drop an episode every 2 weeks on Thursdays. So hope you'll check us out. So
thank you.
Yeah, and you're right. Our first episode definitely involves ethics and mayhem and craziness. You may have heard probably the past year or two, there was a big story that broke in Silicon Valley about a lady named Elizabeth Holmes, who was the youngest billionaire CEO. She had her own startup company called Theranos that was a biotech health company. Basically, her vision was that instead of doing blood testing the old-fashioned way, right? Everybody's been and had blood tests before. They stick the needle in your arm, have to get so many vials, they send it off. Days, weeks later, you get your results back, right? So her thought is, let's do it with a tiny little vial. You may have seen, if you've ever seen pictures of her, she's usually standing there holding a vial that's like tiny. And it's going to be like a finger prick of blood. So painless, quick, easy. Anybody could do it. And then she created this machine called the Edison, where you could drop that in and it would test it all. And think about the size of like your printer you have at home. That's what this Edison was touted to be, this small, so you could have it in your homes. It could be used on the battlefields for testing quickly, just this great and wonderful thing, right? And so she definitely got tons of investors involved, raised, again, a billionaire. Her company, I think at the highest was worth about $10 billion. The only problem is her tech never worked. Never.
Yeah, like never. And it was valued at 10 billion, whether or not it was worth that. I think we'll
worth
see.
and valued.
Yes.
It wasn't at all.
So what exactly happened, that really caught your eye and helped you say, oh, we need to share this with other nonprofits. We need to talk about this. This is the case study for us.
I heard about this when I was teaching a grant management class. Whenever I teach those, I tend to show off relevant cases of fraud related to grants, like all of us do, right, when we teach grant stuff. And so during one of the breaks, I had a student come over to me and said, hey, have you ever heard of the story? There's a book called Bad Blood. And I was like, no, I've not heard of this. And he said, well, there's this interesting case out of Silicon Valley. And he goes, it has nothing to do with grants, but he's like, but it's just a fascinating case study of fraud. You should check it out. And I thought, okay, so I've got my, like all of us, right, our long list of to be read books. So I add that to my list, but there's a lot of stuff on there. And so a few months later, I'm on an airplane, and it's one that's long flight. They've got a TV, and I'm scrolling through trying to figure out what to watch. And there's something about I forget the exact title, but it talks about bad blood. And I was like, it was a documentary. I was like, I wonder if that's that same book that gentleman told me about. So I decided to check it out. Sure enough, it was. So I watched it and was so fascinated with the story that I just immediately, after watching it, I read the book, and then I found a podcast about it and listened to it. And so I just thought, man, this is such a fascinating story. And I really thought there was some parallels between what she did and lessons that we could learn in the nonprofit and local government and grant field. And so I came to Kimberly and I was like, what do you think about this? And kind of made sure I wasn't like doing something wild and crazy, like seeing something that wasn't there.
Which is usually part of my job description, I think, when we come up with things. But also, not only, and we'll break it down and talk about it, not only is it a good case study of what not to do, if you're ever in those situations where someone might ask you, why can't your nonprofit function more like a business? Let's think about the implications, because this is a business model that has been very successful in Silicon Valley when there were actual products, or sometimes when there weren't actual products. And I think it's just a great example of what not to do that has many different implications, really, for all kinds of decision-making and strategic planning decisions and board development and involvement. All these components play out in something that was fascinating and also involved billions and billions of dollars. And who doesn't like to read about something going down like that? I think there's, what's that German word? Schadenfreude? Sorry. If anyone speaks German and
that was offensive,
completely offended,
let us know. We'll put in the B plate or
put it in the comments below. But it's what it is taking pleasure in the misfortunes of others, kind of. Right. And so, but I think that's an innate part of human beings. I think it's like, if you can learn while you're going, wow, sometimes good doesn't always follow money. I think it's just an interesting discussion.
It is.
Well, and it's nice to learn from, I've learned from my own mistakes, but I'd rather learn from somebody else's mistakes so I don't have to make them first.
Yeah, and so you don't, the jail time, the profiles in leading magazines about what you did wrong, we can avoid all of those things.
Excellent. So, and I think, so there's two things I want to say real quick. So that's probably one reason why we're all educators, is we want people to not make the mistakes we made. And then we want to look ahead and avoid some of the mistakes that we could do, and also help other people not make those mistakes. But we've alluded to some of this stuff. What exactly happened with Theranos and Homes?
So basically, like I said, she came up with this idea, and she was in college when she came up with this idea. She was I think a freshman at Stanford, and midway through her sophomore year dropped out because she was like, I'm not going to class anymore because I'm spending so much time trying to raise capital and put a board together.
For this idea.
Yes, for this idea, and working on her patents and all that good stuff. So she drops out of college, creates this company that she later names Theranos. It's called that. She wanted to combine therapy and diagnosis. So that's where the name Theranos comes from.
It's a good name.
So she puts it all together. And like I said, she's touting this is what I want. Not a bad idea. The problem was, for a while, every time she kept pitching it, a lot of scientists kept going, great idea, but the science, we're not there yet. Like you just can't, that's such a small amount of blood that's not enough to be tested. Plus the machine, all it has to do, it's not going to work. But she just kept pitching her idea till she found enough people who bought into it. So already from the beginning, you've got something that like, we don't really know if it can work. But she puts her team together, starts building it. And it just kind of, from there, the lies just keep building of, she's claiming to have this product that still is not working. Like she's got her lab working on it and testing it. It never worked, ever. Never. Never mind that she had a contract with Walgreens in Arizona. They were going to start it off with all their Arizona big box retail stores there to do testing there. So she signs a contract with them, and it's still not working. So they're doing these samples and sending it to her, thinking she's using it. Yeah, she was using the same tech. Like she bought the same machines that LabCorp and who's the other?
Well, like Quest Diagnostics. Any of those big names.
Those are the two big blood testing companies. Yeah. She bought the same tools they used, but was claiming it was her machine that was doing the testing. And she made claims about, she said the military is using it in Afghanistan on the battlefield. Yeah, military that never ever once even I mean, they don't think they even talked to her about using it.
Right.
So it was just kind of lie upon lie. She bought into her own hype. And the interesting thing, if you watch the documentary or read the book, plenty of her staff were coming forward going, testing's not working. This is problematic. It's not going to work. You need a bigger machine. But she was just so sold on, I don't care. I said it was going to be this small of a vial. I said it was going to be this size of a box. Make it happen. And it never worked, and she didn't want to listen.
And so I want to distinguish this too. I think, Amanda, that was a really good summary. I want to distinguish this too between having big goals, like, we'll put a man on the moon, like what JFK said back in the 60s, but he didn't say, we'll put a man on the moon in a pink capsule that looks like the bottle from I Dream of Jeannie, and I'm really showing how old I am now, but he didn't put all these specifics. He didn't put all these specifics on it. It was, we will get there. Now, scientists and experts, make it happen. And that to me is one of the, this goes off the rails everywhere, but that's one of the big ones. It's like, it's this big goal, but then you have technicians and scientists and research people to get there. And I just see this in nonprofit work all the time, where a funder who is well-meaning is like, or a board member is like, well, we should do it that way, without having any buy-in from the people that they might be trying to serve, or the direct service provider staff, or any connection with the sort of the logistics and the how it can work. So I think trying to dictate an exact format was one of the many ways that she went off the rails. But that is not to say that we're totally against setting big, wonderful goals. That's not what this is about.
Excellent.
But you've got to balance goals in reality, right? There needs to be a little
set the goal and set people free to reach that goal, and don't get up in the business of the people that know how to make things.
I want to come back to something that Kimberly said, which was, you mentioned the board of directors, and Holmes, from what I hear, put together an impressive lineup on her board of directors. But where did she go wrong?
I am happy to jump all over that. Amanda, are you good with that?
Go.
Love it.
So I have to just start off by saying there's no way any of this could have worked if she hadn't had a heaping, helping dose of white privilege. Straight up. She got that board. If you were I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, maybe it's happened, but if you were a young woman who's African-American, who was going to a top-notch Howard, Morehouse, not Morehouse, Spelman, I'm sorry, and you drop out because then you have this little thing, and all of a sudden this idea, first of all, I don't know that any of those folks would have necessarily come to the board. She had lots of privilege and connections that come with that. So that was one thing that pushed her over pushed her out over the top into this star-studded board, if you will, packed with people who knew nothing about lab testing. Right. There were people who knew about making money, and people who had military expertise and political expertise, but there were no, and again, I don't think you should stack your nonprofit board. What you need different skills.
Right.
But there was no one on the board, I think, who could, in that old story about the emperor's new clothes. Right. There was no one who had the right pair of glasses to see that the emperor had no clothes. And so I think that, when you're asked to serve on a board, you need to figure out what's going on and whether that or not that makes sense to you. And if you're serving on a board, I feel like you need to dig in and ask questions about strategy and guidance in that way. So she was able to work her connections and her family connections to land these folks. And then, in my opinion, I wasn't there, but kind of just didn't tell them what was going on, and maybe just didn't answer their questions and chose to kind of sidestep things and do things. And as Amanda mentioned, that it wasn't just with her staff, it was also with the board.
Yeah.
But
And
go ahead.
well, I was going to say, and her board of directors, I'm sure you guys have heard of these people before, right? So George Shultz, who was a former U.S. Secretary of State, was on her board. Sam Nunn, a former U.S. Senator. Henry Kissinger was on her board of directors. So she had just a whole lineup of folks. I mean, she did have William Fogy. Is that how you say his last name?
Fogy, Dr. Fogy from the CDC.
Yes, from this. So, I mean, you do have one person that at least has a little bit of medical background, but he was about the only one. And the work he did at the CDC, not the same as this biotech thing. So you've got these people on the board that, while impressive in their own right and amazing, I don't think they would even know what questions to ask her. I mean, that'd be like putting me on that board. I'd be like, sure, sounds good, because I just don't know. And so I think it behooves you, when you're putting together a board of directors at your organization, you want people that at least know the questions to ask. And it doesn't have to be everybody, but you need some. And honestly, I think she got Henry Kissinger on board. I'm pretty sure half these people are like, well, heck, if Henry's on board,
right,
why not? I mean, like, we all do that, right? Kimberly says something's a good idea. I trust Kimberly. I'll be like, sure, why not? But you need to ask questions.
And I'm also not, starting and bringing wars and interrupting political policy. I'm just offering
that, you know,
opinions
yes,
that I know of, But I think, it was like, well, if he thinks it's a good idea, and also they were all he's. I'm pretty sure they were. There might have been.
I think so.
Mostly white, mostly old, mostly not connected to the field at all. Like there was no one on that board. But then I think when people did try and ask questions, it was sort of that dog and pony show. And having worked with boards, it's like, you don't want a board that is micromanaging you, but at the same time, if your whole basic premise is not at this point technologically even possible,
Right.
Well, and I think it's dangerous too, because, the book often compares her work to other startups at Silicon Valley, right? Like Uber, like Apple, like Facebook and things like that. And she was compared to a lot of those gentlemen who started those companies. But the difference is, if Facebook didn't work, I mean, yes, investors might lose money, but it's not a threat to people's health. She's touting this as working. They're using it, trying to test people's blood. And, they were getting false positives. They were getting false negatives. So can you imagine if you use their system to check out whether or not you had HIV and it came back as negative, so you think, I don't have it. That may change your actions and how you do things. And you could, or there's a story in the book about a lady who had had survived cancer. And of course, every so many years has things checked up to make sure things are going well. She had some wonky results that her doctor was convinced her cancer was back. And the amount of money she spent on additional tests to figure out what the scare, the feelings that came with that for her and her family. I mean, it was awful until they finally figured out nothing's wrong with you. It's the test.
It's the test.
And then Theranos tried to silence the doctor who was going, I don't think this is working. And so they were trying to bully her into not sharing her story. There was a lot of bad stuff going down.
And I would say the implication, the carryover from that is when you have bad outcomes in your program and it's grant funded, or you fall short of your fundraising goals, or you fall short of your program goals. Most funders I have worked with, not all, but most funders I have worked with get that, as long as you're like, hey, we thought we would be able to serve 60 kids, but only 30 came because if you're coronavirus, or it's hurricane season and, we got a lot of roads that are wiped out down here in South Florida, or whatever it is. And to just own it and go, this didn't go as planned. Here's our plan to recruit more kids, but not to just say, everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine. It makes me think about that meme of the dog with the hat, and he's sitting at the table in a restaurant. It's all on fire behind him, and he's like, everything's fine. It's like that. I think that's also is admitting you're tracking your data. You see when there's a problem, you go, there is a problem, here's how we want to fix it, and just communicating that instead of trying to say, no negative, because that's not
Well,
life.
even if it's
It's
so
not life.
horrible, because it was just you had this idea, no one's tried it, you tried it, and it just was a bad
Or
idea.
could the blood be this much blood? Could
Hmm.
it be this big? And it could be like, because certainly because she was like a big super fan of Stephen
Steve
Jobs, right?
Jobs.
Yeah. So he trotted out some products that were like wah wah, and then he had just the iPhone. It was like, you know. So it was just a strange sort of, it's got to work this way. And it's like, actually, if you look at your heroes in your journey, a lot of them failed multiple times trying to get stuff to market. So yeah, I don't get it.
So that's a good question. So her idea was brilliant.
It's a
but
great idea.
What compelled her to start lying? Do we know?
Nowhere, because of course she wouldn't, anybody who was doing the book and the documentary and the podcast, they tried to question her and get interviews. She wouldn't participate, probably because she's any day now, because it was supposed to happen last year in 2019. She's supposed to go to trial, so she could potentially land in jail for defrauding investors. So she's not talking. So nobody really knows yet, the truth, and we may never know. My guess is that she just so wholeheartedly wanted this to work, believed in her own hype, that it was like, I think this lie started small. And you know how it is. You lie about something, and then you've got to have another lie to cover that up, and another lie. And I think it just kept snowballing. And I think she truly I think she liked the fame and the fortune. And one thing everybody that did talk about her talked about, she wasn't someone who just like slapped her name on something and had nothing to do with it. She really did work her tail off. I mean, she worked way more than 8 to 5 every day and was happy. That was her life, was this company. But I think it just started snowballing, and she didn't know how to backtrack from that, is my guess.
I think that like you said, we do see that in organizations. We see that with grants. We see that with large programs. There are programs that they don't last forever. Your program that you do may need to turn down. It might be its time and transition to something else. And if we aren't constantly looking at that and building that into our grant process, that where is that thing failing? Where's the failing thing? Because there's got to be something that's failing, because nothing's perfect. And then being able to report on that. Are you seeing more funders really asking that question in the grant application about how are you going to deal with missed benchmarks or with unpredictability or unpredictable events that and what will you do to rectify that? Because I have, if you haven't.
I haven't seen it yet, but I think part of it is certainly in the classes that I've taught, I usually will get that question from people newer to the field. Well, what if we get the grant and then it goes wrong? They'll come and take back all the money. And I'm like, oh, that's how this gets started. But I think it would behoove funders to be a little more straightforward. The standard components of a grant usually include evaluation, right?
Right.
But it's more like, how are you going to measure it? The question isn't, how the objectives, what change do you think will happen? The evaluation section, how are you going to measure that change? But there's not one question that's coming up more that I'm seeing, which I think would be good, is how, what plans are in place to adjust the program if it's not meeting expectations. So some of that is a built-in fear factor, I think, that I'm hoping is not intentional on the part of funders, because that's just crazy. But some funders maybe, but other funders, it's like they're not thinking that through. And so you can get the impression that failure is not an option, which is not the way these things should work. It's for programs. Now, if it's an equipment, it's like, did you get the grant for equipment?
Right.
Did you purchase the equipment according to the policy? I mean, that's very different. But if it's programmatic or clinical research trials, right?
Right.
There's tons of stuff where people have falsified results to keep getting funding.
Yes.
And then people do other studies based on the falsified results, and it snowballs because it's hard to stop. But I wish that more funders would have, Joe, your experience of, or the wisdom or the wherewithal to go, okay, so if it's not going to plan, what is your plan?
Yeah.
Maybe that could be in the reporting process. Maybe they could change the reporting process where it becomes a check-in, because I think sometimes holding so hard to outcomes that we're not sure are actually going to happen, or that it's setting people up to cover up and lie out of fear of losing funding and losing access to services. But
yes.
Well, I've often had, a lot of times when I teach, I'll have state agencies in my class. So people working for that, they're trying to get their own money, but they're also then turn around and subawarding stuff, right? So they're both the reportee and the reporter. And more often than not, when I get questions like you're talking about in the class, usually they'll pipe in and go, hey, I am a program officer. Every time someone comes to me and says, here's an issue, I'm going to work with them and fix it. But they're like, but you'd be surprised how many people are too scared to come to us.
I'm not surprised because they don't come out and say it. So I'm like, you got to help people understand.
I think the funders need to do a better job of going, we realize that your application, that is your best.
It's a snapshot. It's a snapshot of where you are with the best information that you have and the best thing you can put forward. And my goodness, haven't we seen in the last 6 months, you can plan all you want and then boom, now what are you going to do? You know,
exactly.
So it's, yeah, I think I would hope that more funders would follow the funders, Joe, that you referenced and do that.
Well, I think that's a great other topic for us to talk about sometime. What does that look like? How can we as grant applicants and or funders, because some of us have multiple ways that we're coming at this, but how can we educate funders to create a culture that allows for failure? Because failure and identifying failure means more success. If you don't identify that failure and you keep going, you have more failure, right? That's how it works. But if we don't create a culture where people can fail, then they can't step back to succeed. So I think we'll do another one on that and talk about that in our experiences with funders and with grantees, and give maybe some not so great, well, they're all great stories, but some stories where people have gone down that rabbit hole of just trying to fix it and they can never get traction because it's never going to work. And then those funders who have learned from their grantees, and in my particular case, over about 20 years, that they need to put this in there, that they need to create that culture. So I love that. But I think that it sounds like from what you're talking about, that there was this culture too, that we're going to make this happen.
At all costs, beyond realism.
Well, and Elizabeth Holm isn't on trial because her product doesn't work. She's on trial because it didn't work, and she lied about it. She lied to investors and stakeholders and her board. And so, but if she had just been honest, going, we're not there yet. The tech's not there yet. Now, chances are she might not have gotten as much money because at some point people are going to pull out. But
I don't know. There are plenty of other companies we could point to where
that's true. That's true. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, but I guess that just brings up to my point again, though, where it's just a pet peeve of mine when people are like, oh, you just need to run that nonprofit more like a company. I'm like, really? Defrauding investors out of millions, inflating your prices, treating workers horribly? Yeah, sign me up. That's a great idea.
The other thing is there's a lot of rules and regulations for nonprofits that make them so that you can't run them as a business. And, well, as a for-profit business, let's get really clear here. You're in business.
Yep.
You are in the business of running your nonprofit. Your nonprofit is a business, but it is a nonprofit business that is regulated very differently than
you can't pay dividends. You need to, any profits you make need to be reinvested back into the programs and services. There are other differences, but that's like the primary one, and it's not how the precepts are the same. The precepts are the same in terms of you want to get something. In this case, you're offering a service, a charitable kind of service versus a widget, but it's the same idea. I mean,
it really is. It really is. So, any last sort of wrap-up thoughts on ethics and mayhem and how people can avoid going to jail, basically?
Do the right thing. Tighten up on yourself and do the right thing. Help others see the right way.
Yeah, I think honesty is always the best policy. That's better than being caught in a lie. And I think bringing it back to grants, I think it's imperative for grant writers when you're putting your team together, because we can all talk about how this is not a solo sport, right? We need program people, we need finance people. You need a team of people who know their stuff and aren't afraid to question, like, hey, why are you doing it this way? Because I'll tell you, anytime I put together a grant, one of the first person I send it to is the program person who's going to have to implement it.
Heck
And
yeah.
my first question is always, is everything I said doable? Because if not, now's the time to tell me, not when we're 6 months into the program, because that's almost too, I mean, not that we can't tweak it, but it's harder. So like, I think it's just putting that team of people that know what they're talking about and being honest with what
and encouraging that openness too.
Yes.
Because program director, if things are not going according to plan, let's talk about it and see what we can do. I mean, that's not the board member discussion, but internally it's like, what is happening? If people aren't showing up for this, there's maybe a barrier that we didn't know, or a barrier that's come up to accessing these things, and what can we do? And then bring in the funder and see, can we redirect funds to this? You know, do we need to give people gas cards because they live out in the country and they can't get to the, whatever it is, just to be open and talking about that.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And I'd say I'd end on, as leaders, whether you're leading as the grant person or your board of directors, I think you have to balance vision with practicality. So I hope nobody's watching this going, I guess we should never set our sights high. No, absolutely. I love stretch goals, but let's also be practical about how we're going to get there. So,
yeah. That is excellent. And to wrap that in a tiny little thing, grant professionals, I believe that our job is to take that dream, take that vision, that way far out, beautiful vision that organizations and founders and programs have, and make that a reality in a step-by-step process, in a doable process. So I love that about our profession, the opportunities that we have to give dreamers the steps to make their dreams come true. All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for being here. I love this story. I'm going to have to go. I didn't know there was a movie or a documentary. I'm going to have to go watch that.
There's a book. There's a documentary.
Gritty.
And an ACES podcast episode about it.
That's right. Tell us about that. Where can they find season 3?
Fundraising HayDay. We're on we're on Stitcher, Spotify,
Apple Podcasts,
or you can find us on fundraisinghayday.com.
And it's HayDay, and we acknowledge that that's not how you usually see HayDay spelled, but it's a combination of our names. So don't add us about that. It's Fundraising HayDay, HayDay.com.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
As always,
it's such
a pleasure to see you, to talk with you, and I hope you'll come back. Thank you all for being here. Now, go out, get grants, and do good.
Okay. Bye now.